We're going to look at three things: that Gideon had a willing spirit, that he was prepared to be different, and he was a man with doubts, right? When he said he was going to be committed to the truth, he didn't just like shoot out of a cannon and never look back. He had doubts that he had to wrestle through. But he did get shot out of a cannon to start with. So look, for example, at verse 25, where Caleb picked up in the story that he read for us. Because remember what Gideon was doing when the angel found him, because all of this is going to continue to happen like as one continuous story. It says in verse 25 that the same night God comes to him. You know, that's the way God works with us sometimes. He says, okay, if you're going to get baptized, or if you're going to be committed to doing the work, or if you're going to go to a study weekend, I'm going to put your faith to the test right away. Like, don't think that you're going to have a month now before the next trial that you face, or the next time God's going to test your faith. He'll probably do it within the next couple days, even if you're off school next week. He'll still find a way to do it. He'll do it in your house. He'll do it with your siblings. He'll do it with your parents. He'll do it with your aunts and uncles at the ecclesia. He'll probably do it this afternoon at the ice rink for some of us, right? He finds a way to put our faith to work right away. That's how God works with us. And later on, we're going to find that Gideon is a man who rises early in the morning. In fact, you know what's really neat about this story is that if you read through the story of Gideon all at one time, which we're not going to take the time to do right now, it doesn't take that long. This is actually, it almost reads as though the whole thing happens back to back to back to back to back to back. I'll show you what I mean. In chapter 6, verse 25, right here that we just read, this happens the same night that the previous thing happened. And then in the next verse, it's that night. In verse 28, it's early the next morning. In verse 31, it's the same morning. I'm not going to read through all of them on the screen because that's like rule number one of putting a list on the screen. Don't just read the list. You're capable of reading, right? It's like the story didn't happen that fast, but it's like God wants us to see this progression of events all the way through to chapter 8, that Gideon is a man who got to work. God kept him busy, and he kept him busy in the work, and Gideon was willing to do that. He had a very willing spirit. It's like we have this small window of time that we can see his life, and God says, let me just show you how busy and diligent this man is, because he's ready to go, and once he gets started, it's like he never stops until the work is done. And these were not easy tasks. These were not easy tasks. So it's a good lesson for all of us that when there's hard things that need to be done, don't just keep putting it off. Don't keep, somewhere in the last 5 years, I learned the expression, kick the can down the road. Don't just keep kicking it down the road. You got to buckle down and get to work with whatever needs to get done, right? Gideon was preparing in the spirit that Hebrews 4 verse 7 says, today. Get to work today. Don't wait until tomorrow. Stop procrastinating, of which I am really good at. And we're all really good at that, right? So one profession that pretty much everybody has in common. We're all professional procrastinators. We don't want to be like that. Well, it's one thing to be willing to get to work. It's like when, if I said right now, I need a volunteer. And I wasn't going to put you on the spot because I don't want to trap you with that. But I could say it works really well with young kids. I need a volunteer, and all the hands go up. And then you're like, you have no idea what you're volunteering for. It's a little bit like that with Gideon, because God says, I'm going to put you to work. And then look what the work is. Verse 25 and 26. So Gideon, this is what I need. Take your father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old. We'll talk about what that means in just a second. And throw down the altar of Baal that your father has. And cut down the grove next to it, in your father's backyard, as it were. And then build an altar to Yahweh your God upon the top of this rock in the ordered place, and take the second bullock and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the grove that you've just cut down. Ooh, that's what I'm volunteering for? That's a pretty tall order. You're still eager to put your hand up to volunteer? That's a pretty difficult thing to commit to. Effectively, what he's saying is, your dad has a 7-year-old bullock in his pasture or in the backyard or something. And then, again, does anybody have a different translation in verse 25 besides Josiah? I don't want to pick on him again. Where in my Bible it says, take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock. Does anybody else's Bible say anything different besides even the second bullock? Do they have a different word? Yes, Simon? And the second bullock. Now that seems like a really insignificant change. In fact, the margin in my Bible says that too, so maybe yours does too. There are 2 bullocks here. Now, why is that important? Well, we'll see in a second. There's 2 bullocks. One of them is 7 years old. Now, who can think of why that's interesting? A 7-year-old bullock. Where have we seen that before in the story? 7 years old. Yes. Midian, yes, exactly. Midian has been oppressing them for 7 years. So when was this bullock born? In the very year Midian started oppressing. And what had Midian been doing? Back the page in verse 4, they had been leaving no sustenance, no sheep, nor ox, nor ass, and yet Gideon's family had found a way to preserve this bullock from being taken by the Midianites. And now God says, take that prize bullock that you've managed to keep hidden from the Midianites for 7 years and go slaughter it. Probably didn't say it like that, but that's what Gideon has to do. He's about to make himself hugely unpopular in his very first act that God's asking him to do. This is a tall order. Now the rubber meets the road, and his determination and his willingness is really tested. Now, as was read, and as we just read there in verse 25, cut down the grove. Does anybody else's Bible have a different translation besides Josiah and Simon? A different word than grove in your Bible? Does anybody have the New King James or NASB or NIV or I'll just keep picking. Oh, Uncle Steve, what do you got? Excellent. What do you have in verse 25? The Asherah. Ooh, now, what is a grove? It actually is the Hebrew word Asherah, which is why a lot of other Bibles use the word Asherah. When I think of a grove, I think of like an olive grove or a grove of trees. Well, it is a grove, but it's actually a special kind of grove of trees, and it's actually a really horrible special kind. Because what the Asherah was, we won't get into the details, but what Asherah was is it was this place where you could go where they would cut trees down. That's why it was a grove. That's often the way it's translated. They would cut the trees down, and then they would carve out of these trees horrible things that allowed you to go and worship other gods, Asherah. And often you'll find in the Bible, grove is associated with Baal, because Asherah and Baal, Asherah is basically the female form of worship that goes along with Baal. So they kind of go hand in hand. And it was horrible, sinful things that they did at the grove. If you wanted to have a good, sinful time, you didn't go to the movie theater back then, you went to the grove. That was where you found all sorts of, they would make, it was horrible things that happened in the grove. And God says, you're going to go cut that down. And you're going to use that wood, and you're going to make a sacrifice of that prize bullock that you've managed to preserve for 7 years. But take this in. Just consider that for a moment, that the very first thing God asked Gideon to do is start in your own house. Because that's the principle, the broader principle God's trying to teach. Gideon, the problem with the Midianites starts in the nation. It's not in the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east. It's right in your own house. And you know what? I think one of the principles that we learn from that is if we want to start making changes in our life, it doesn't actually start in your house. It starts in your own life. It starts in your own bedroom. The decisions that you make in the privacy of your own life, where God needs to start that work. And then he's going to say, okay, now that you've made a commitment to me in your own life, now I can use you in my service more broadly. And that's what God is teaching Gideon here as well. In fact, Christ would later say, in fact, let's turn, Matthew 10. Come over to Matthew 10. Because Christ would later say in Matthew chapter 10, these words in verse 37. And these are hard things. And I don't say this so that you can go home and decide, you know what, I need to go home and stop loving my parents. That's not what Jesus means when he says here in verse 37 of Matthew 10, he that loves father or mother more than me, Matthew 10, verse 37, is not worthy of me. And he that loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. So God says, in Jesus' words here, that putting the truth first means putting God before everyone else. Which means in Gideon's case, when he lived in a house where his dad had a grove in the backyard and they were sacrificing to it and having a good time in sinful ways, Gideon starts there. You got to be prepared to stand separate from your family, to stand out from your family. Why? Because we're not called to fit in. We're called to stand out. And that's difficult. That's really hard. When we live and work and go to school with people in a world who are very different than us, God says, Gideon, you got to be prepared to stand out and be different, right? We think of good old Daniel. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. That's Gideon had that same challenge in his very first act of service to God. And as we said, this 7-year-old bullock that God told him to take in verse 25 is a visual reminder. It's a reminder that this bull was born in the same year that Midian first came. Because that's the last time, perhaps, where they had been offering acceptable worship and service to God. You need to go back to where you had been. Get rid of the false worship. And he wants, remember last night, for those of you that were here, God is using that 7-year, that number 7, to remind them of that covenant with Abraham. You have to go back to the faith of Abraham. Get back to your roots. Get away from the things that you've become steeped in and get back to your roots. He's trying to prick their conscience. So we said that there's 2 bulls going on here. Now, we're not going to make a big deal out of it because I can't prove this to you, but Uncle H.P. Mansfield, he says in his book, Story of the Bible, he makes a suggestion that, well, the older bull is going to be slaughtered, right? It's going to be, not slaughtered, maybe slaughter is probably not the right word. It's going to be sacrificed and offered as a sacrifice on this altar that we'll talk about in a minute. So what happens to the younger bull? I can't prove to you what happens, but it's kind of interesting to think about. Uncle H.P. Mansfield says maybe the younger bull was used to do the work of pulling down the grove and the other service, right? That a young bull might be better suited for. Can't prove that to you, but if you have thoughts or you've ever thought about, what happens to the second bull? We'd love to hear your thoughts afterwards. What is clear, though, from verse 26 is that the bull is to be offered and where it's to be offered. Because we said in verse 25 that it was Gideon was supposed to tear down the altar of Baal and build a new altar. Verse 26. He has to go to the trouble of building an altar. And you can't just reuse Baal's altar. You have to build a new altar. And what's interesting about that is that word where it says in verse 26, build an altar to the Lord thy God upon the top of this rock. You know that word, this is the only place in the whole Bible that word is translated rock. Every other place, it's translated something like a stronghold or a fortress. Or the Psalms, David rather, in 2 Samuel and in Psalms, refers to God as this stronghold. So normally that word is translated that Gideon, you're going to go build this altar in this stronghold. God's telling Gideon, look, I am going to be your fortress as you do this. This is not going to be easy. It's not easy to make changes in your life, and it's not easy to make changes when they involve other people. It's not easy to stand out and stand alone. But God says, Gideon, I'm going to be your rock and your stronghold, your fortress through this. So every other place, and I think there's about almost 40 of them, 37 other places, that word rock is translated that way. Because God knew that this is not going to be easy, but he's going to and that's where it is. The passage in 2 Samuel 22, verse 33, that's where David says, I think it's David there, says that God is my strength and my power. That's what he says. And really, this is what God is teaching Gideon and what he's teaching us, young people and brothers and sisters, is what we call the displacement principle. You've probably heard people talk about this. You can't just get things out of your life if you're not going to fill your life back with other good things. It doesn't work that way. You remember the parable story that Jesus told about the man who swept his house and got rid of all it says unclean spirits. There were 7 unclean spirits. He got rid of all the filth out of his life. But then he just left his house empty. And 7 things even worse came back in. That's the getting rid of the flesh and sort of recognizing that sin and the flesh is not a puppy. It's not just a matter of, well, I got to just get the flesh out of my life and get its influences out of my life. You have to fill your life with other good things. Because if I stop my bad habits and I don't find other good things to do in their place, my bad habits are going to come back with a vengeance. Probably worse than they were before. That's the way the flesh is. It's not the puppy, right? So we have to get rid of the old things, like Gideon, cut down the grove, slay the bull, and let's start Israel in a new path, showing them on this new altar. This is the kind of worship that God wants us to pursue. And he's going to help us do it. Now, verse 27 is one of those little tidbits that make Gideon so relatable. Look at verse 27. Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as Yahweh had said to him. And so it was, because he feared his father's household and the men of the city, he couldn't do it by day. He did it by night. That makes him really human. Gideon, he couldn't do it on his own. And even with 10 of his buddies, he couldn't go do it in broad daylight. Why? Because, well, the Asherah was a hopping place in the daylight hours. And God says, okay, this is what you got to do. And Gideon says, well, this is the most I'm capable of. I kind of need 10 friends to help me with this, and we're going to go do it in the darkness. But God doesn't condemn him for that, because he knows this is a tall order. But Gideon also understood that principle, the strength that you find in friendship, good, godly friendship. He didn't try to do it on his own. He didn't get overwhelmed with life and the truth. He said, well, I'm going to need to surround myself with other people who can help me. It might be tempting when you read verse 27 to say, oh, what a chicken. He couldn't do it on his own. He knew God was with him. But Gideon was no dummy. Gideon knew that if he went and did this at night, the sun's going to come up in the morning. And everyone's going to see what happened. And everyone's going to know who it was. That's how the record continues to read, which we'll come to in just a minute in verse 28 and 29. He knew that. So it's not like he's trying to do it so he can just, let's sneak out at night and go do what the angel told me to do, and nobody will know it was me and I'll get away with it. That's not at all how Gideon does this, and he knows that's not going to work, even if that was his motivation. Verse 28 gives us the people's reaction. The men of the city arose early in the morning. It's like, well, the sun comes up and the evidence is sitting on the ground. The smoke is still smoldering from the sacrifice. Behold, the altar of Baal is cast down, the grove was cut down that was by it, and the second bullock was offered upon the altar that was built. And they said to one another, who has done this? And they didn't have to ask for long, and everybody knew, Gideon. the son of Joash. There it is again. See, there's one of those 8 times. Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing. And this is why we say Gideon knew that despite the fact that he did it by night, that he would be the prime suspect, public enemy number 1, first thing in the morning. Because it was so obvious to everyone when they saw what had happened. Well, who's the type of person that would do this? I can think of someone. Because he has a reputation. This is the kind of thing that Gideon was known for. How did they figure it out? Because Gideon had a reputation for loving what was good and hating what was evil. He was one of those faithful few that still remained in Israel. This is exactly the sort of thing I could picture Gideon doing, right? That's what the people would have said that morning. He was labeled, as it were. Sometimes we get that label, don't we? It's not easy to have that label of being that person that, well, guys, we probably shouldn't do this. Or guys, we probably should be going to bed. Or guys, are we really supposed to be going there? It's uncomfortable. None of us like to do that. I was not that person when I was young. I'm still not that person now, admittedly. I'm the one that's just like, man, I'll wait for Uncle Steve to say something about it. Raz, he didn't say anything. Right? It's really uncomfortable to stand up and stand out in a crowd. But Gideon had a reputation for doing that in his town. And God could use that kind of spirit. Put yourself in Gideon's shoes. He's living in the midst of idolatry in his household with a family, his own family, who is practicing daily idolatrous things. He's trying to stay separate from evil practices, to stay true to his conviction. It's a really strong and tall example for us in those times when we find ourselves in a situation, maybe even with friends in the truth, where we have to be willing to stand up and say, hey, probably we shouldn't do this. Gideon experienced that same difficulty. He had to do it with his own dad. But you know what's equally powerful to notice? Is the way his dad responds. Because Gideon didn't go into it with like a very righteous, I am better than you, what we might say like a holier than thou attitude. Because the way his dad responds is so powerful. Look what it says in verse 30. The men of the city said to Joash, bring your son out, we're going to kill him because he's cast down the altar of Baal, he's cut down the grove, he's taken away our fun. Right? He's ruined everything. And Joash, Gideon's father, responds and says, he stood against the men and says, will you plead for Baal? Will you save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death while it is yet morning. In other words, you want to put my son to death for what he did? I think actually on reflection, whoever wants to do that, they should be put to death. If Baal is a god, let him plead for himself, because someone has cast down his altar. Gideon was a man who his own father was prepared to follow his spiritual leadership at times, because that's what good spiritual leadership does. It doesn't go around and use the 2x4 method, right? Where you go around just swinging a club, a spiritual club of banging people over the head when they're doing the wrong thing. Gideon led in a way that other people wanted to follow his example. His own dad. That can seem like a really daunting thing. You know what that's like, young people, at your stage of life, to feel like, but I'm living in my parents' house. Maybe I need to just do whatever they tell me. But if you feel like you've identified something in your own life that you need to get out of your life, talk to your parents about it. They will be inspired by your leadership. Talk to your siblings about it. Talk to your friends about it. If you do it in the right way, other people will be inspired to follow your leadership. That's what Gideon, in his example, shows us. Everybody has the internet in their house these days, right? It used to, not that long ago, you could say, who has the internet? And Sort of half of us would say yes. You guys are growing up in a generation where if you don't have the internet, that's pretty unusual. Now, that doesn't mean you necessarily have Wi-Fi, but you have, I have the internet in my pocket. And probably most of us do, right? As soon as you get a cell phone, you have the internet anytime, anywhere. If you have a data plan, I realize. But the internet is everywhere now. And yet, it struck me a few years ago, you don't actually have to do this anymore. And I'm not even going to date myself. But when you go to a website now, you don't go to www.google.com. You don't even have to type that in. You just type in, G probably, and then it auto-completes and you hit enter and I'm at google.com. What does that www stand for? I'm going to ask somebody who's less than 20. You do know what it stands for. Do they teach you this in school still? Why? It's not even important anymore. Josiah, what does it stand for? World Wide Web. Yeah. Have you ever thought about that? That the internet is a web. What is a web for? A web is for catching things. That's what that is the only use. Well, I shouldn't say the only. But that is the primary use of a web, is to catch things. In fact, I was talking to Uncle John this morning, and it was like, yeah, see, it's a web. You go on I get a little message on my phone or something that says, oh, so-and-so posted a message on their whatever, your form of app is that you like to use. And you're like, oh, what they posted? And before you know it, you're clicking on the next link and the next link, and I'm caught in the web. And you know what? This web is not just any web. It's worldwide. It's so dangerous, right? Now, I use the internet all day, every day for work. So the moral of this story is not go home and rip the internet out of the wall and throw it in the garbage. The moral of the story is you got to be aware of this, right? There are things that if I have the internet in my office at home and I can do whatever I want on the privacy of that, I can promise you that I'm gonna be a wreck. It's gonna be a disaster. So we put things in place in our house that don't let me do that. And that's not for the benefit of my kids. That's for my benefit. Well, it's for their benefit too, but it's first and foremost for my benefit. We have to be aware of things in our home or things that can be a web in our life and take steps to make it so that we don't get caught in that web all the time. Or so that when we do get caught in the web, someone can look over my shoulder and be like, hey, you're looking pretty caught in the web. Let me help you get out of it, right? Just one example. Maybe it's not the internet for you. Maybe it's something else. But if there are things that we need to make changes in, we have to be prepared to have those conversations at home about it, because good leadership inspires other people to follow. And chances are, if I'm struggling with it and I talk to somebody else in my house about it, they might say, hey, this, to be honest, that's kind of a struggle for me too. Let's make a change. And look at the impact that it had on people around him. Because in verse 30 and 31, this is a remarkable turnaround. In verse 30 and 31, they are ready to kill Gideon because of what he's done. And then by verse 33, only a couple verses later, he has completely turned them around, because good leadership inspires other people to follow. Look at how Gideon impacted his father. In verse 31, he says, let Baal plead for himself. If he's a god, well, then he'll reach down from wherever Baal lives and strike Gideon down. Ooh, there's a good Bible echo. Can anybody think of another man who said, if Baal be a god, let him plead for himself? Yes, Simon. Elijah. Is that what you're going to say, Jacob? And everybody else who started to raise their hand on that. Elijah, right? This is exactly what Elijah would say. And I wonder if Elijah had Gideon on the brain when he says that, because he's looking back for inspiration to men like Gideon when he feels very alone in a time of Baal worship. And he says, if Baal wants to do something about it, he will. That's exactly what Elijah says on Mount Carmel. So now they have to take this difficult step. Make a choice. Gideon's provided an example, but it's up to the people whether or not they're going to follow that example. Now, verse 33 says that the Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of the east are rounding their troops. They've come way past Gaza now. They have come into the valley of Jezreel. Now, the valley of Jezreel is a huge area. And actually, I'll put the border. See this? The big thick line there in the middle. The valley of Jezreel is the big kind of funny-shaped area between different mountainous ranges in this area. And that red line is the border between Manasseh and the next tribe up. So the valley of Jezreel runs right through Manasseh's territory. Ofra's right on the border. What's Ofra? Ofra is the city that we're talking about. That's where Gideon came from. Right on the border with the next tribe. And the Midianite host is there in the valley of Jezreel. They are like well into Manasseh's territory now. They're on Gideon's doorstep. So in the last class, we talked about how Gideon could have said, not my problem, with a different tribe. Well, Midian rampaged through those tribes, and they are right in Gideon's backyard, as it were. But the remarkable thing is, as we started to allude to before, the way Gideon led people inspired them to follow him. Because look what verse 34 says. The Spirit of Yahweh came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and Abiezer was gathered after him. What's Abiezer or Abiezer? That's his area, right? Joash, Gideon's dad, was an Abiezrite or Abiezrite. So Gideon calls, and a whole bunch of people come running. The Spirit of Yahweh comes upon him, and this is the response of the people. But they still only number 32,000. How many people did the Midianites have? Does anyone remember? Because we don't read that until later on in chapter 8. 32,000 is a lot of people you're going to battle with. Chloe. How many, sorry? Ooh, close. 100 and something 5. You're thinking of the story of, I think, Sennacherib with Hezekiah, so that's great. 100 and, Jono? 135,000. Now, which would you rather have, 32,000 or 135,000? I thought I had a lot of people with 32,000 people, but I don't really want to take that into battle against the whole city of Sudbury, right? Sudbury is actually a little more. I think Guelph is closer, but Sudbury seemed a little easier to picture because Sudbury is huge. We're not going to go into battle with 30,000 people against the whole city of Sudbury. But look what the record says in verse 34. When the Spirit of God came upon him, Abiezer is gathered to him, because this is what 2 Corinthians 12 says. God's going to teach Gideon, doesn't matter how many people you have. In fact, the fewer people you have, the easier it's going to be to see that it's not based on how many people you have. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. Because when I am weak, Paul says, Gideon, when you are weak, then I can show myself to be strong, is what God says. And that's why you can't underestimate what God can do with you, because it doesn't matter how much strength you have or how many abilities you have or how young or old you are. God says the weaker the better. The more fragile the vessel, the greater the power I can show in that vessel. So he'll put you in circumstances where you feel like there's no way I can do this. And he says, now I've got you where I want you. Because that's where I can show myself to be strong. And the proof of that is that the same men who back in what verse was it they wanted to kill him? Back in verse 30, the same men who are calling for his head are now rallying around him. Because in verse 34, Abiezer are the very ones who had wanted to kill him. And yet they're the first ones to answer the call. But it gets even better than that. There's way more than that. Because do you see as verse 35 continues, he sends messengers throughout all of Manasseh. And Manasseh comes after him. And then they go out to other tribes, Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali. God started with one man, which then grew into one family, which then grew into one tribe, and then 3 tribes, and eventually, by the time we get to chapter 8, he's going to have galvanized the whole nation around him, because that's what good leadership does. There's a brother back home who said once, he said, good leadership knows the way and then goes the way to show the way, and other people follow. That's what Gideon does. And he ends up inspiring the whole nation to come after him. And this is not just any cause. This is not just, hey, we need a few volunteers to help set up for lunch downstairs. This is a situation of impossible odds. This is a huge task. So let's give a simple, not a specific example, a broad example. Let's say that you've just had to be that person in your peer group that was like, hey guys, maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe we should be doing something else. And then 5 minutes later, you have to be the same person in your peer group who says, hey, I need some help doing something. Right after you've just had to gently kind of tell your friends, we probably shouldn't do this wrong thing, or whatever it is. Gideon did it in a way that in one moment he can be saying, we got to get the Baal worship out of this area. And in the next moment say, I need your help. And everybody comes running. That's a really, really powerful example of leadership. Because I'll tell you what, when somebody comes to correct me, it can be days before I'm even ready to speak peaceably to them, depending on how they did it. It's a really powerful example that Gideon can correct them, destroy the idolatry in his hometown, and yet everybody still comes running when he says, I need help. That's incredible. That's the kind of leader that he was. But now, the task is in front of him. He's got 32,000 men gathered. Okay, that's great. But he doesn't know yet how big the host of Midian is. He could probably see it down in the valley of Jezreel, but it's not like he could count it and say, well, it looks like they've got about 135,000. But he knows it's a huge host, and that's going to come out in our next class in chapter 7. Anybody who saw it could see that it was a big host. And now he's the leader. So put yourself in his shoes. You are responsible for the lives of tens of thousands of people. And your leadership will determine whether they live or die. Now, you know that it's not the strength of your own hand, that God is with you. But that doesn't mean that everything is just going to go perfectly just because God is with you. There's lots of times when bad leadership resulted in, especially during the period of the judges, bad leadership resulted in a lot of people dying. So Gideon's faced with this reality. Leading thousands of men into battle against an army that outnumbers you 4-1 is pretty daunting. And Gideon's not sure. And it's really beautiful that God is okay with that. Because God knew that Gideon's faith is still developing. If we tried to put it in a box or something, we could say that Gideon has this much faith, and God is going to take this much faith and he's going to stretch it and make it a little bit more. And then he's going to take that much faith and stretch it a little bit more and make his faith deeper and stronger. But he works with him based on where his faith is at that time. Gideon has uncertainties, but that doesn't make him turn around and hightail it back for home. Go back to, let me just live in my den and cave. He stays there, and God works with his faith. He wants reassurance that God will save Israel. And he says in verse 36, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. Now, we could stop there and say, wait a minute, Gideon, he already told you. Does he need to repeat himself? The angel has already said he's going to save Israel by your hand. That's what the angel had said back in verse 14 and verse 16. You should know this by now. Why are you still questioning that? But that's not how God handles him. He needs reassurance. And he realized Like we looked at last night, that quote from Uncle Robert Roberts in Ways of Providence, he realized that God works by means. He needs to work through something. Gideon can't just stay in bed and pray for deliverance, say, God, I'm not going to get out of bed. I know you're powerful enough to destroy the Midianites. Please do. Much more fervently than that, of course. He got up that day because he knew that God needed him to go to work. Because God uses us. He won't open the door magically for that older sister who's walking into the hall with her arms full, no matter how hard you pray. He needs you to do it. He needs you to be the means by which he can work. And that's what the angel says. And that's why Gideon says, but I'm still not sure that it's my hand. Is it actually going to be me? And Gideon knew that it's not his hand. It's not, his right arm. He's saying what the angel had said. I'm going to do it by your hand because you know that in your hand there is no might. But if you open your hand, what am I going to put into it? I'm going to put the Midianites into your hand. That's what Gideon understood. So he needs this reassurance, and it's really comforting that that's how God works with us. God says, look, you need to work out your own salvation, but I'm going to do it in you. I'll be working in you to help you work out your salvation. That's what he says when Paul writes to the Philippians. So Gideon says, is it really going to be by me? He's already had one sign, right? The sign where he made the offering and the fire came up, not down. That's kind of cool. We could talk about that later. Fire came up from out of the rock, consumed the offering. But he wants another sign now. In fact, that wasn't the only sign God had given him, because not only had he accepted his offering twice, he then goes to purge his household, just to kind of review these facts. He had gotten huge support from those around him. It's clear God has been with him, and he's still not sure. This, I find, is so easy to identify with when we kind of second guess ourselves, those moments where we're just unsure of not sure. Maybe it's, those doubts about our faith based on, how do I disprove this argument that somebody just gave me? How do I don't know if God's really does he really need me to do this in my CYC? Like somebody else can do that. Like, why is this, it's not my job? I'm not a leader. I don't want to have to do that. God says, no, I'll show you. I'll reinforce your faith. And Gideon's actually in good company. But that's the kind of humble spirit that God can work with, like we said in our last class, right? He needs that humility as a starting point to work with. And other men like Abraham and Moses were in the same place when God first called them. Uncle John Martin has this great quote. He says, great men are often very small in their own estimation, and they seek assurance from the one who is so much greater than themselves. That's where God needs us. Not in a place where we feel like, yeah, I'm good at this. I'm a natural born leader. No, he actually needs us where Gideon is, which is, I don't know if I can do this. That's exactly where God wants us in a starting point, as a starting point. So we got 5 minutes. Let's just finish this section off with this sign of the fleece, because this is a really powerful sign that God gives to Gideon, or the angel gives to Gideon. And what's really neat about this is that the drama that's been developing is going to develop even further. For example, where was Gideon threshing wheat when we met him in verse 11? He was threshing, yes. In a wine, I see all these hands in the back. I keep putting out, Josiah raises his hand at the same time as all of you, and the speed of light gets to me faster from there than it does from back there. Sorry, Benji. Is that what you were going to say? In a wine press? Excellent. So he's threshing wheat in a wine press, right? You know what's kind of neat? Now he asks for this sign. Where is he in verse 37? I'm not going to give you the answer. Where is he in verse 37? Yes, Sammy. Ooh, he's not in a wine press this time. Simon. He's at the threshing floor. Now, if your Bible's like mine, it just says he was in the floor. That's kind of hard to be in the floor. But it actually, every other place that word is used in the Bible, it translates it threshing floor. So I don't know why I didn't hear, but he's in the threshing floor. Ooh, look, we've come full circle. We found Gideon threshing wheat in a winepress to hide the wheat from the Midianites. But now Gideon is out in the open expanse of a threshing floor because God has taken his faith and he's built up his faith a little bit. And now Gideon's out in the open expanse of a threshing floor. He's asking for a sign. He's exposed now. And where are the Midianites? They're in his backyard practically, right? That map that we saw, they're in the valley of Jezreel, right on the edge of the border of Ophrah. And Gideon is now in the threshing floor. And God gives him this sign. Now in the last 2 minutes, we're just going to blast through this sign really quickly. I wish we had more time, because this is amazing. It's amazing what God does with this sign. He gives Gideon this sign that Gideon asks for. Now, to be fair, Gideon asks for this sign. And he says, God, well, let's read it, verse 38. Verse 37. Behold, I'm going to put a fleece of wool on the floor, and if the dew is on the fleece, and is dry all around it on the earth, then will I know that you will save Israel by my hand. Now that would be pretty amazing, right? You put a piece of fleece on the ground and say, you go to bed that night and you pray and say, God, make the fleece wet and everything else dry. That's a pretty amazing sign. How amazing? So amazing that it says in verse 38 that he picked up that piece of fleece the next morning and he wrung it out, a bowl full of water. When have you ever seen that much dew on it?